Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Whitener with Bridge Innovate, and we are excited to welcome you today to our program, Foresight Scouts. It's an overview of a new program that we're launching at Bridge Innovate. The new offering debuts June 17th of this calendar year. Is a remote professional development experiential program. So today in our program on Foresight Scouts, we want to talk a little bit about strategic foresight as a body of work. We want to introduce you to that if you're new to strategic foresight, talk about Bridge's framework, and then introduce our program that we're launching in June of 2020, Foresight Scouts. So let's continue on. First, let's talk about what is strategic foresight. Many of you, if you've been in the field of strategy, may be very experienced in strategic foresight, or if you're in the field of futurism. But strategic foresight is the practice and capability of anticipating and planning for the future. It sounds very simple, but it can be very complex to actually do. And in fact, in our organizations today, if you were to ask any particular leader, and maybe for those of you who are on the webinar today, how much time do you spend looking back at historical trends and historical data, or maybe your leadership team, to make decisions about the future versus how much time do we spend anticipating trends, mining and gathering data, advances and trends to then make decisions about the future. Many organizations in this age, the industrial age, have perfected the practice of looking back, using data and looking back at past performance to predict the future. This whole shift with COVID-19 is an excellent example of how something very dramatic like a pandemic can completely transform the way our organizations and how we are engaging. So how do we get better at anticipating these significant disruptions and anticipating these trends? And how do we build the critical thinking capability for our teams and our leaders to anticipate these types of trends and then to formulate potential responses so that we're better prepared and able to execute and thrive in those disruptive environments? When you look at the body of strategic foresight, that body of work, and you see which organizations are really embracing that, according to a longitudinal analysis by Corporate Foresight, there's significant performance improvement for organizations that invest in strategic foresight. So you can see here, prepared firms outperform the average by 33% higher profitability. Future prepared firms outperform the average by 200% higher growth. When you think about the pace of acceleration, that when a trend hits and accelerates quickly, you have to be prepared. Your leaders really need this competency of being able to anticipate trends and formulate possible solutions to address those trends. That's what gives the resiliency for these organizations to prevail in the essence of disruption. So at Bridge Innovate, the way we think about foresight is we think of it as a leadership competency. We think of it as something that as leaders grow and develop in their strategic and critical thinking acumen, that they build their capabilities and skill sets, and they lead their teams with a focus around strategic foresight. The way we think of it is that when you look at the entire life cycle of business, from designing products and services to mobilizing, leading them into the marketplace, and then achieving a change or result, it's really strategic foresight. It's the review and mining of trends, whether they're societal trends, customer behavioral trends, technological trends. It's the understanding and extrapolation of those trends that become the fuel for how we innovate, how we mobilize strategy, and how we mobilize our teams. And so that strategic foresight broadens our perspective. It broadens our mindset to move beyond the current tactical to then to address more futuristic scenarios that give us bigger, bolder opportunities in our organization. When I think of strategic foresight, this particular example helps me put it visually, right? So when you think about today, and we think about Foresight Scouts, even as a cohort, a collaborative cohort that will be working together online, we'll be looking at trends and patterns and drivers of change. We'll be mining those and collecting those as a cohort. So we take our point in time today, we mine for those particular drivers and trends, scanning research and Google Trends and desktop research, talking with individuals and leaders, gathering those trends. And from that, we begin to identify major drivers of change and significant things that we need to spend more time analyzing and exploring so that we can unpack alternative futures to prepare our organizations based on those trends. Those then become our preferred future rather than us being a victim to a future. We're actually being proactive, identifying trends, and proactive, identifying future solutions to address those trends so that we help to shape more of a preferred future in our organization rather than being a victim to it. Those then preferred futures begin to influence our strategic plans and all the activities that we mobilize in our organizations to win. So if we keep going, this is another view to me of strategic foresight. If you look at this particular window, this cone of perspective, you'll see in the first 1 to 2 years, this is where we're looking and thinking and acting tactically. This work from Amy Webb at NYU and the Future Today Institute shows us that most organizations today spend a lot of their energy and activity around the tactical momentum of their organization. It's very few leaders that then look at the strategic perspective, and then even less that get to the visionary component of where their organization should go. But when you think about the pace and scale of change today, many disruptions and many drivers of change that when they hit very quickly. Do you think of what happened with Airbnb or with Uber when technological advances came in, how quickly they shifted a complete industry? So this lack of insight of future trends tends to result in a loss of opportunity, and it creates great vulnerability in organizations through disruption. So this example that Amy gives in Harvard Business Review around her framework for strategic planning talks about this very simple example where she was doing strategic planning for a company that produces golf carts. And they were looking at significant trends like the expansion of the elderly population and the growth of that population. They were looking at things like climate change and all of the issues around that. They were also looking at technological advances like autonomous last mile logistics or computer vision or the AI and the cloud. They started to see different entrepreneurial startups launching small vehicles that were autonomous that could move packages at short distances. When you put all of those trends together, she was working with this golf cart company to look at possible new innovations where they could repurpose the golf cart so that it could be a climate-controlled delivery vehicle able to transport people, medicines, groceries, supplies, and even pets autonomously without a human driver. If you think of even some of the early advances from Wuhan when the pandemic first hit, they were starting to use these autonomous small delivery robots to take medicines and supplies into areas that were under very difficult circumstances where the virus was very prevalent. So we see these types of technological advances. How could we begin to imagine how this might impact our products and services or even next generation solutions? This next example begins to show you how this type of data analysis and trend mining could represent itself potentially in a brief to an executive team. So here's an example that Amy from NYU shares around smart city initiatives, where a team has looked at a number of major trends and drivers, defined a key insight around those particular trends, and then said, why does that matter? And then giving examples of how that may play out into a future. You'll even see that they have identified a particular mapping grid over here to the left, where they'll look at these trends, determining what that might mean in terms of a key insight, and then helping their executives or helping their leaders determine, is this something that we need to act now on, or is this something that we may need to just watch diligently so that our organization is not a victim to disruption, but we're proactive at identifying trends, we put things on the watch list, and then we're better prepared to respond. Who's investing in strategic foresight? So you see many brands here that are very well known in the marketplace. Disney, very progressive in terms of, and for years has a major strategic foresight initiative in their organization. Deloitte, Lockheed Martin, Shell, Nike, Eastman, number of different companies, very forward thinking, allowing strategic foresight to look at not only the back end development of product and services, but also customer engagement and the use of technology in terms of how they're redefining the customer experience. Some of the tools that they're using in strategic foresight are things like scenario scaffolding, trend analysis, weak signal analysis, even future wheels. And some of these tools are the things that we'll be exploring in the Foresight Scouts program. As we think about the program itself and what type of skills and competencies we'll be touching on, it takes me to this strategic foresight primer that was created by the Future School by Kedge. And they talk about the leader that has foresight. The mindset of the leader that has foresight would demonstrate these types of skills and competency. They would crave curiosity. They're constantly looking for the next trend, the next why, the next shift in the market. They're constantly looking at diversity. They welcome it. They're constantly asking for different perspective. They act courageously. And many of them would think that people would describe them as leaders that act outrageously. They might champion a thoughtful project team to explore a particular bold trend. They may connect dots where wouldn't be obvious to begin with by connecting things that may support each other, just like in the golf cart example. They may think in multiples. So many times today, what we're seeing with organizations is that teams and divisions are not thinking about a strategy. They're thinking about strategies, multiple, the plural, that as trends and patterns evolve and the pace in which they evolve, how will they move forward strategically? So those things that are on the must watch closely list, do we have a strategy in our back pocket to respond to that if needed? So these are the types of skills and competencies that a Foresight Scout would begin to build and would emulate in their organization. One of the things that comes to mind with the perspective of foresight and the skills that are needed, the one thing that we always open with in that type of program is to ask the scouts, ask the leaders involved in Foresight Scouts to explore this issue of bias. And that so many times we miss trends and patterns because we have an unconscious bias that would never happen, or that we don't believe it, or we don't want to delve into the pattern because it's uncomfortable. And we have to understand as leaders and as humans that there's 11 million bits of information that hit us at every moment, and the brain itself can only consciously process about 40 bits. So that means that a lot of information that we're hit with every day, every moment, that we're processing unconsciously. And so one of the gifts that we have as humans is that we have this bias modeling that helps us process that information. But we also have to understand as a leader when our bias modeling needs to be put on check, and when we need to put it on a pause and be aware of it so that it doesn't curtail or filter our opportunity to see new opportunities. This type of awareness training for leaders to understand bias modeling, to understand that it's natural, and then to also be able to be consciously putting it a bit on pause to open up our perspective can help us in foresight. It can help us in leadership generally, in managing teams and in building diversity. But it's an important concept that we have to address as Foresight Scouts. So here's just a quick question for folks. I'm going to hand this off to Mary Kim, Senior Consultant with Bridge Innovate, and ask her to take her forward and introduce us to this phase of the program.
Thank you, Jenny. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today. As Jenny mentioned, strategic foresight can help us anticipate beyond the present to providing perspectives of unforeseen opportunities in the future. And just now, she helped us look at, unpacking that unconscious bias that just naturally occur in humans. So let's, she mentioned, things that are uncomfortable. People tend to avoid. So let's look at this prompt here. 3D printed food customized for your current health needs. Just a fun exercise. Let's see what you answer. Yes, I'm totally into that, or no, I'll pass. All right, Colin says, no, thank you. Need more info? Okay, maybe, we need to build trust. Yes, could be interesting. I would say I personally probably land on more of the no, I might pass. Maybe like you said, I might need more information. I think for me, the bias comes from like, I have this tendency to not want to share information with others, not knowing what that's going to be used for. So I wanted to share an existing kind of an inspiration piece that's already pushing the boundaries of food technology. That's right, not culinary, but food technology. Jenny was kind enough to actually share one of this inspiration with me called Sushi Singularity. I'll ask Colin if he can actually show the website because I think it's quite interesting. If you have not heard of Sushi Singularity, I recommend checking out their website. It's quite inspirational if you're into the future trends. I think, of course, this in particular is looking at the hyper personalized dining experience using not only the restaurant environment, but technologies such as kind of health scanning. They send you a kit. You send your information just like 23andMe, and they essentially put together a customized menu, dining experience that's 3D printed. And of course, the cuisine is sushi, which is maybe even more unsettling, the fact that, you think of sushi, raw food, how does that get 3D printed? And actually one of the pieces that kind of really blew my mind is this 3D printed octopus roll that's they have created this structure in a way, designed the structure so that you have the sensation of kind of that chewiness of bouncing back when you are eating or when you're expecting to eat like calamari or octopus piece, right? So what stood out to me, other than the fact that 3D printed sushi can sound really interesting and awesome, is being able to look at some of these signals that's out there, even before it becomes a trend. Maybe the hyper customized piece or the health ID. Obviously, many of companies are starting to explore that already. And also some of the partnerships that startup has built, the power of startup and entrepreneurs to really dig into something that maybe a larger organization is kind of hesitant to dive into, but maybe with different partnerships, opportunities, you can kind of think beyond, what people might typically think of as a sci-fi novel topic into reality that ties many future trends that, surface. Jenny, do you have, what stood out to you when this piece of information came to you? What inspired you?
I think much of what you're saying, Mary, in that when you think about how these different patterns are colliding, thinking in multiples, the advances in technology, the hyper customization, this microsite 3D printing, the food scarcity issues facing the world today, how all of those are coming together with Sushi Singularity in terms of a solution for that. Now, this is more the high end, but then how can we use it to feed the world in areas where there's scarce food or less nutritious food? So I began to think, what could this spawn for me? What ideas, what triggers could it create for me to create other solutions? So many times I think what we have to look at is these things can be inspiration for future opportunities.
Absolutely. So let's look at a historical inspiration. Many of you, if you have looked into strategic foresight, probably would have come across Shell. So I won't dig too deep into it, but in 1965, Shell actually had initiated a project, Unified Planning Machinery, UPM, that's supposed to be using computational method to predict kind of 6 months ahead. So that's something, using past data to predict the next 6 months, as Jenny mentioned, 1 to 2 year being more tactic oriented. So this would be that case. At the same year, actually, they also had another initiative that came about. Colin, if you'll show us the next bit. Perfect. So the Another department tackled what they called long-term studies, which evolved into scenario planning. So there are many actually information out there about shell scenario planning. There are lots of informative videos, but that's been going on for 45 years. The department that started off using the computational method ended up closing after a few years, whereas scenario planning continued to actually accelerate and help the company even 45 years after. Uh, I think it shows the value of strategic foresight, being able to anticipate future scenarios, and even companies like Shell, which to many people may appear conservative, have used this method to help them accelerate and compete in a very competitive market. So what does that framework look like at Bridge in terms of strategic foresight? Is 3 large buckets and then 6 steps that go along with it. So the Foresight Scout itself is actually covering the 1/3, the beginning part of where we see the process. So the unlocking biases, exploring scan signals out there is a big piece of what the Foresight Scout will focus on. So it's going to be a lot of mining data, what's out there, looking at the signals, and synthesizing information to come up with some opportunities to further explore. And then there's that focus phase of mapping, more of that scenarios that I just mentioned, with Shell being, a kind of a catalyst for, as well as designing the future. So looking at the vision and the goals, Jenny mentioned earlier, strategies, not just strategy. So this is where a lot of that prototype will come about. And then the last phase is act, where lead and adapt come up to fruition. So not only are you coming up with strategies, you have to have a plan to potentially implement and or continue to test or continue to scan. And that comes with, a perspective of change within your organization, which is crucial. Get the buy-in, make sure that that's part of a bigger process of what an organization will walk you through. So that's the higher level of framework of strategic foresight. Thank you, Colin. I know I am running out of time, so I'm going to try to quickly go over this. Those of you that are interested in the program itself, what do you need to get ready? Well, first we need you, the participant, and we hope that you'll bring on a sponsor, a team leader, an organization leader who can be part of actually what we're calling show the world, the output. And of course, access to internet. My assumption based on you joining us today is that you have all this criteria ready to go. So we're excited. And part of why we think this is important is building that leadership skill to help anticipate future trends. You're going to gain access to Foresight Toolkit that you can learn, utilize, and hopefully be the catalyst to be the futurist in your organization. And of course, this is going to be a unique skill set that will help your career path. On the next slide, we'll show you really quickly, high level, there's the key takeaways. This information is also available on the website, and I mentioned the skills, the toolkit. One of the things I want to add to that is the output we're calling Foresight Brief. And with this includes various tools that you'll be the cohort members will be utilizing, such as the pestle scan and synthesis that we'll do as a cohort and individually, the futures wheel. I'll show you what that framework looks like if you're not familiar with it. Essentially, it helps you identify some of those first, second order, consequences and opportunities based on the change itself, and putting together a deck of scenario cards, which will help with future scenario planning. And of course, that digital badge, that credential that you've gone through the program. As Jenny mentioned earlier, this is an online cohort, completely virtual experience that runs in 2-week time frame. And you can expect anywhere from 13 to 16 hours of commitment, and the tuition information is there. And if you have any information, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email. This information, again, is also available on our website. I won't dig too much into what the 2-week frame looks like. Just know that there are 6 key touch points as a cohort that lasts anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. And expect about an hour to an hour and a half of individual work that will require to make sure that you have a really great experience from. So the key steps that you see here will be scope, scan, synthesize. We'll look at implications. Of course, we'll spend time putting together that Foresight Brief. And the sixth session I mentioned earlier, Show the World, is where you would invite your observers, your supervisors, your teammates to showcase the Foresight Brief that you put together after a 2-week time frame. So the platform we'll be using is going to be sprint-based. If you're familiar with our work, you might have seen that we use sprint-based for design thinking. We are customizing that platform so that it works well with our Foresight Scouts program. If you're not familiar with it, go check it out on our website. There's plenty of information out there. It's a seamless platform that helps us run a virtual collaborative session really well. Before, I know it's already at time, so bear with me. I'm going to go through the next few slides really quickly just to show you the framework that you can expect to see some of them. So here's Pestle Scan. Of course, we're going to not push ourselves to really dive into all the different categories of Pestle to broaden our perspective when we're looking at those signals and trends out there. So political, economical, social, technological, legal, and environmental. And that's going to be based on a topic that the cohort determines as something that's really critical and important for them. Next, you'll look at Futures Wheel. After we've had a chance to explore and notice some of the connectors right after synthesizing the scanning that the cohort team will do, is that you'll identify one critical change component that you want to further explore. And that will, Futures Wheel, as I mentioned earlier, will help us explore the implications. So the consequences and opportunities of that key critical change that will take place either in general or to your organization. So there will be opportunities for us to explore both. And one of the things, if we'll actually skip over the next one, Colin, and jump over to future scenario card, you might be familiar with scenario planning. Before we get there, we're going to, have put together essentially a collateral that helps us consolidate our research finding and then come up with a set of values and implications based on, is this important? How far, ahead will this happen? What are the opportunities that you see? Putting all that together in a way that makes sense and easy for others to understand what you've gathered. We're going to put that in a card deck, and hopefully that's going to be a key takeaway that you can take back with you that the cohort produced.